On an ordinary evening in August, someone called 911 from a quiet street in Palm Coast, Florida. The caller said his mother had just been attacked. He said a man in a mask had done it and fled into the dark. Within hours, investigators would be standing in that same front yard asking a very different question. Not who attacked Michele Shimmel, but why nothing about the story matched what they were finding. This documentary contains details some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. If cases like this one, where the evidence itself becomes the investigation, keep you watching until the very end, subscribe now. This channel breaks down real cases the way real detectives work them. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Before any of this, there was simply a house on Woodhollow Lane. Michele Baker Shimmel had owned that home since 1995, more than 2 decades in the same place. She raised her children there. She built a life there, the kind of life that rarely makes headlines. A mother in her 60s, living with her adult son and her daughter, holding a household together the way people quietly do every day without anyone noticing. To her neighbors, Michele was simply part of the street's rhythm. A familiar car in the driveway, a porch light that came on at dusk, the kind of presence people register without ever having to think about it, until it's gone. 22 years is long enough to watch a neighborhood transform around you, to see other families move in and out while you stay. It's long enough to become, in a quiet and unremarkable way, part of the fabric of a place. There was no history of trouble at that address, no prior domestic violence calls, nothing in the record to suggest that house was anything other than what it looked like from the street, an ordinary home on an ordinary block. Detectives would later confirm, when reconstructing the case, that there had been no indication, no warning sign on file anywhere that anything was building toward violence inside those walls, which is exactly what makes the evening of August 23rd so difficult to reconcile with everything that came before it. At 7:28 that evening, a call came into Flagler County Dispatch. On the line was a young man who identified himself as Nathaniel Shimmel, Michele's 22-year-old son. His voice, according to the recording, was calm, almost too composed for what he was describing. He said a man in a mask had attacked his mother. He said he'd been on the back porch, heard screaming, and came around to find her on the ground as someone ran from the property. He said he hadn't approached her. He'd gotten in his car and driven straight to a friend's house nearby. When the dispatcher asked if Michele had any enemies, he answered almost immediately, his father. For nearly the entire length of that call, later reported to have run close to 20 minutes, Nathaniel maintained the same even tone, not panicking, not breathless. To anyone listening only to the recording, it could have sounded like a young man in shock, doing his best to stay composed under pressure. But composure on its own isn't evidence of anything. It was simply the first detail investigators would eventually come back to. It was the kind of call that sends deputies racing toward a scene, prepared to search block by block for an armed stranger. Within minutes, patrol units were converging on Woodhollow Lane, some setting a perimeter, others beginning the deliberate, methodical process of clearing the property room by room, yard by yard. But almost from the moment they arrived, the story began to work against itself. There was no broken window, no damaged door. Nothing inside the home suggested anyone had forced their way in. As deputies swept the property searching for the man Nathaniel had described, they found nothing. No suspect, no footprints leading away, no sign that a stranger had ever been there at all. What they found instead was Michele in the front yard of the home she had lived in for more than 20 years. The first deputy on the scene attempted to revive her while awaiting emergency medical responders. It was not successful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. If there was no intruder, then the story Nathaniel had told the dispatcher only minutes earlier had a serious problem, and detectives were only beginning to find out how serious.
Deputies located Nathaniel a short distance away at a friend's house on Woodhollow Lane, exactly where he'd said he'd go. He was covered in blood. Detective George Christopoulos, one of the investigators who responded that night, later documented finding blood on his chest and in a substantial amount on his shirt. For investigators, this alone raised an immediate question. If Nathaniel truly never approached his mother after the attack, as he'd claimed in the 911 call, why was there this much blood on him at all? And when detectives began asking him to describe the man in the mask, the details he'd given so confidently on the phone started to disappear. How tall was he? I don't know. What was he wearing? I don't know. Which direction did he run? I'm not sure. A masked stranger, dangerous enough to kill, and Nathaniel could not offer a single consistent detail. To an experienced investigator, this kind of pattern, confidence on the phone, followed by vagueness in person, is often a signal worth paying close attention to. People describing something they actually witnessed tend to remember fragments, even under stress. People describing something they invented tend to struggle, precisely because there's nothing real to recall. Then there was the blood itself. On his collar, on his chest, he told detectives it must have happened when he got close to check on his mother to see if she was okay. But that explanation created a new problem, because minutes earlier, on the recorded call, he had said something entirely different, that he never approached her, that he'd run the moment he saw her on the ground. Two different accounts of the same 10 minutes, and they could not both be true. It was a small crack, the kind experienced detectives are trained to notice immediately. Contradictions like this rarely announce themselves. They surface quietly, buried inside routine follow-up questions, and it's the investigator's job to notice when two versions of the same short window of time simply don't fit together. And once they started looking more closely at Nathaniel himself, they found more than just blood. A small cut on his cheek, another near the bridge of his nose. His glasses, he admitted, had come off at some point that evening. For someone who claimed he'd never gotten close enough to help his mother, these marks were marks that told a very different story. Not the injuries of a witness who fled a stranger, the marks of a struggle. Detectives didn't raise this contradiction with Nathaniel right away. Instead, they turned their attention to the surrounding houses, expecting the neighborhood canvas to at least partially confirm what he'd described. A tall man in a mask fleeing a residential street in daylight hours should have been difficult for anyone nearby to miss entirely. Instead, deputies went door to door and heard the same answer again and again. No one saw a masked man. No one saw an unfamiliar vehicle. One neighbor, working in a backyard nearby, told investigators she hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary that afternoon. No raised voices, no strangers, nothing that stood out. Another described the Shimmels as a quiet family on the street, one she didn't recall ever hearing argue. If a masked man had really fled that property in broad view of a residential block, where had everyone else been? With no physical evidence of an intruder and no witnesses to support the story, investigators shifted their questions in a new direction. Not toward the crime itself, but toward the household, toward what daily life on Woodhollow Lane actually looked like in the weeks and months leading up to that night. What they learned reframed everything. Family members described a pattern that had been building for some time, not a single flashpoint, but months of tension between Michele and her son, most of it centered on the same unresolved issue, Nathaniel's lack of steady work and his resistance to changing that. Michele, by these accounts, had grown increasingly frustrated. She had reportedly begun restricting parts of the household, hoping to push her son toward independence, an approach relatives described as a last resort after more direct conversations hadn't worked.
This wasn't the story of a single violent encounter with a stranger. It was beginning to look like the latest chapter in a much longer and more personal conflict, one that had existed inside that house long before anyone called 911. If a case like this keeps surprising you, one where every new piece of evidence changes the picture, This is exactly the kind of investigation we cover every week. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what detectives uncover next. With the inconsistencies mounting and no evidence anywhere pointing to an outsider, detectives brought their questioning back to Nathaniel directly, walking him through his own account again and again. Each pass left him with fewer places to go. The composed voice from the 911 recording was gone. Detectives asked him to explain the blood, to explain the timeline, to explain how a man he could describe in no real detail had managed to vanish without a single witness or a single piece of physical evidence. This is often where investigations like this one turn, not through a single traumatic confrontation, but through the slow, repeated pressure of being asked to account for the same 10 minutes from a dozen different angles, until the story simply runs out of room to keep making sense. Under that pressure, sustained across repeated interviews, Nathaniel's account did not hold. He told detectives that on the evening of August 23rd, he and his mother had argued again, this time about the same issue that had strained their relationship for months, his future, his refusal to look for work. Investigators would later confirm her final words to him that night were simple and direct. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." He said she reached for his arm as she spoke. He said, in his words, that he panicked. He picked up a knife from the kitchen counter. In the moments that followed, his mother was fatally wounded, and then, he admitted, he made the decision that would define the rest of this investigation. He staged the scene to suggest an intruder had been responsible before calling 911 and describing a man that had never existed. He knew, he later told detectives, that he was going to be arrested. The entire story had only ever been an attempt to buy himself time. Deputies arrested Nathaniel Shimmel, 22 years old, and charged him with first-degree murder. He was held without bond at the Flagler County Jail beginning that same morning. For most cases, an arrest and a confession marked the end of the story. For this one, it marked the beginning of a much longer wait. The case would remain unresolved for more than 3 years, becoming the oldest pending homicide case on Flagler County's court docket. Pre-trial hearings stretched on as both sides argued over what evidence would ultimately be presented to a jury. Among the most contested issues was the number of autopsy photographs the defense would allow into evidence. More than 100 images the defense argued were excessive and prejudicial, while prosecutors maintained each one served a distinct purpose in establishing the facts of the case. The presiding judge ultimately sided largely with the prosecution, acknowledging openly that the images were, in his words, difficult for anyone to look at, but ruling they were not unfairly prejudicial given the severity of the charges. Then, just as the case neared trial, the pandemic brought Florida's court system to a standstill, pushing jury selection indefinitely out of reach. Courtrooms that once ran on predictable calendars suddenly faced closures, postponements, and safety restrictions that made assembling a 12-person jury, plus alternates, functionally impossible for months at a time. The judge overseeing the case would later acknowledge that the repeated delays weighed on him given how long the family had already been waiting for resolution. He would go on to describe the situation candidly, admitting the case had become, in effect, one of the most difficult on his docket to see through to any conclusion, caught between legal complexity and forces entirely outside anyone's control. Behind the scenes, prosecutors and the defense entered lengthy negotiations. Assistant State Attorney Mark Johnson, representing the prosecution, and Assistant Public Defender Rosemary Peoples, representing Nathaniel, spent months working through the terms of what a resolution might look like. Nathaniel's mental health became a central factor in how the case would ultimately be resolved, shifting what had once been headed toward a full jury trial onto a different path entirely, a negotiated plea. Court filings would later note that a first-degree murder conviction at trial, carrying a mandatory life sentence, was considered an increasingly unlikely outcome given these circumstances, a calculation that shaped the strategy on both sides of the courtroom. In December of 2020, more than 3 years after his mother's death, Nathaniel Shimmel stood before Circuit Judge Terrence Perkins and pled guilty to second-degree murder, a lesser charge than the one he had originally faced. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison to be followed by lifetime probation. Under Florida law, he's required to serve at least 85% of that sentence, meaning the earliest he could be released would come in his 60s. Court records credited him with more than 1,100 days already served, dating back to the morning of his arrest in August of 2017. Judge Perkins, closing the longest pending homicide case on the county's docket that day, acknowledged the unusual path the case had taken to reach this point, one shaped as much by a public health crisis as by courtroom strategy that ultimately determined how this case would end. For the courtroom, it was the end of an unusually long chapter. For the Michele family, it was something else entirely, the final decision in a process they had waited years to see resolved. Michele's family made the decision to accept the plea, choosing to close a case that had stretched across 3 years of hearings, uncertainty, and delay. Accepting a plea to a lesser charge is rarely a simple decision for the family of a victim. It often means weighing the finality of a guaranteed sentence against the uncertainty in the additional years a full trial would require. For the Shimmel family, after more than 3 years of watching the case repeatedly pushed back, the 50-year sentence represented not a compromise, but an ending they had earned the right to choose. It wasn't a verdict that could undo what happened in that front yard. For them, it was simply a way to finally stop waiting for an answer they already had. Looking back at this case in full, what stands out isn't the complexity of the crime itself. In many ways, this was a case that resolved quickly on paper. A call, a scene, an arrest within hours. What makes it remarkable is everything that surrounded it. The confidence of a story that fell apart within minutes of being tested against physical evidence. The quiet, sustained work of investigators willing to ask the same questions multiple times until the truth had nowhere left to hide. In the 3 years that followed, a legal process shaped as much by a public health crisis as by courtroom strategy that ultimately determined how this case would end. What stays with this case isn't the story Nathaniel told the dispatcher on the night of August 23rd. It's the 20 years before it. 2 decades of Michele Shimmel building a home, raising a family, and living an ordinary life on an ordinary street. A life that in the end wasn't taken by the stranger she described to police, but the one person inside those walls she should have been able to trust the most. If this investigation kept you engaged from beginning to end, subscribe for more real cases told the way they actually happened. Let us know in the comments what stood out to you most about this case and where in the world you're watching from.